everything that restorative justice is built upon, that the professor spoke about around restorative justice and the importance of a circle and of the community coming in to say, first, we love you, you matter, you have value. This is not anything about whatever this offense is that you've been charged with, but let's first start with talking about how important you are to this community, who you belong to, and how much we love you. I was just floored. I read the book literally overnight on my bunk, and we got up the next morning and we started our organization and started organizing within the prison. Good morning.
Very exciting to be here, to engage in what I hope will be a provocative conversation. So hopefully we'll have enough time for a Q&A. To sort of set the frame, which is part of my mission, we are in an era of national criminal justice reform. In March of 2016, the Department of Justice, in the aftermath of the Khalif Browder cases and cases like that, issued a pronouncement, an advisory concerning what is going on across this country in terms of criminal justice, with a particular focus on costs, fines, and fees that penalize poverty and adversely affect certain communities. This is very much related to my prefatory remarks. In January of 2017, the Department of Justice augmented that advisory by focusing on juvenile justice. Why is this important? This is important, obviously, not only from a perspective of what's good for youth, promoting positive youth development, but there's also at issue here, and I speak now as a court professional, a public safety imperative. Because now we have robust research which is showing us that detention, unnecessary detention, increases recidivism. We also know that court involvement is traumatic. Detention, unnecessary detention, even for one day, even for a short period, is traumatic. So hopefully there's a confluence of interests that will move us in a way which I think makes sense both for young people and to best protect public safety. In terms of national juvenile justice trends, while the number of people who have been detained in this state and others may have decreased in absolute terms, the profound racial and ethnic disparities, systemic disparities, if anything, are getting worse. Earlier this month, I shouldn't say this month, I realize this is now December. Last month, the Sentencing Project, based in Washington, D.C., released some very, very concerning studies, which show, in part what I'm referencing now, that while numbers of people who are being detained may be decreasing in absolute numbers, the ethnic and racial disparities are becoming more pronounced. As of today, young people are African American young people are 5 times more likely to be detained, held by courts than are white people. Latinos are 3 times more likely to be detained than white people. Similar numbers are concerning as regards Native Americans, people who are LGBTQ, people with emotional disabilities. This is obviously not good. Now, I want to make the segue to how I came to restorative justice to make this connection, because it's related to what many people call the school-to-prison pipeline, what people like Marian Wright Edelman call the cradle-to-prison pipeline, because we're talking not only about mass incarceration in the criminal justice system, we're also talking about what people like Jill Lepore, who wrote this very provocative piece in the New Yorker in the aftermath of the baby bond case, calls the child carceral state. Hence the basis for Marian Wright Edelman's referencing what she calls the cradle-to-prison pipeline. So I come to this work first as a public defender. I was a public defender for 20 years. I know Andrea because I had the pleasure of meeting Andrea when I and others created what was called then the Roxbury Youth Advocacy Project, which is now which became the template for a statewide public defenders agency now called the Youth Advocacy Division. And I met Andrea in 1991 or 1992 when she told me what her new position was going to be at the Youth Advocacy Project as our community liaison, and we've been friends ever since. I know Susan because Susan helped teach me about restorative justice. I teach juvenile law at Northeastern, where Professor Rothstein is on the faculty. Andrew, I've had the pleasure of meeting relatively recently, but it's sort of interesting, this group, because I'm going to be talking about diversion at the front end. We have Arthur now at the back end, reentry, and Andrea as well. So to get back to the school to prison pipeline, youth who don't graduate high school are 8 times more likely to get arrested than youth that do. I was resistant to the concept of restorative justice for many years. I thought it was antithetical to what my conceptions of due process were. I had this knee-jerk feeling that the community should not impose a normative value on my individual client. My career has always been about giving voice to youth. It took me a while to challenge my own orthodoxy and my own personal belief to realize that restorative justice, in fact, enhances hearing from youth, and I'm going to tell you briefly why. As part of the criminal justice reform that I referenced, we're talking now about the possibility of, for the first time in Massachusetts history, expunging a young person's record. As of today, we don't have expungement in Massachusetts unless a person is found to be factually innocent and some fraud has been perpetrated upon the court. This is directly related to what Michelle Alexander talks about in The New Jim Crow, that label, that stigmatization that precludes getting jobs, working for the military, becoming a police officer, working with youth in a variety of contexts. Some of you may be aware that the United States Supreme Court has, through its recent cases, decreed that what we now know is that children are not little adults. This shouldn't be revelatory. But the United States Supreme Court, in abolishing the juvenile death penalty, mandatory life without parole, has told us what we as parents intuitively know, and what we knew at the dawn of the 20th century when the first juvenile courts were created, that kids are not little adults. But now with brain imaging science, we have the neurobiological information to have moved the dial. So it's ironic that in an era when we should be focusing on how to apply concepts of proportional accountability in all contexts, that includes revisiting constructs such as zero tolerance, collateral consequences that attach when an adolescent is detained, we are still experiencing a very, very counterintuitive and I submit retributive narrative, which is called the criminalization of adolescence. In the post-Columbine era of apprehension, we've had expanded zero tolerance deployment of police officers in schools on a wide-scale basis without first thinking about their relationship and deployment to educators, which has had really, really unintended consequences, directly related to the school-to-prison pipeline. So I, as a person who represented youth for 20-plus years and adults as well, a judge for 20-plus years, started to really rethink restorative justice. And I actually went to a restorative justice training at the invitation of Professor Maze-Rothstein, and what I experienced was quite profound. Youth who are involved in a circle really have voice in a way that they don't have during perfunctory court processing. I don't know, have any of you ever sat in circle? It's quite amazing. If somebody told me, this old dyed-in-the-wool due process advocate, that I would have sat in circle 5 years ago, I would have said, take me out and shoot me. It seems so hopelessly kumbaya to me. You sit in a circle, nobody could interrupt anybody else, everybody talks in turn. It really encourages and demands reflective listening. It makes me as a judge less judgmental. I think it makes us all less judgmental. In fact, in addition to the use of circles as a sanctioning tool, I think it's just a great way for people to communicate and to problem solve. As regards cases on the ground, an adolescent has the potential to go from being eternally stigmatized as the problem to a problem solver. It's really sort of fun when you see, if you sit in circle with the youth and they hold what we call a talking piece, they hold that little piece. It could be a rock, it could be some totem from whatever the community is. And they talk into it like it's a microphone, that somebody's really listening to them maybe for the first time. Those of you who've gone to courtrooms see all too often how quickly cases are heard, sometimes processed. For example, after I leave you, I'll be rushing up to Lowell, and I probably will be hearing 30 cases. I wish I could spend all day in every case, because every child deserves all day, but we don't have that luxury. My due process concerns have been assuaged very, very simply. If a reparation agreement cannot be realized, the case returns to the trial track, and any statement attributed to a child cannot be used later to prosecute them. So that protects the due process piece. So I became involved in restorative justice. Susan and I and others created our RJ. You have material on your table concerning some of our work, how those cases work in delinquency cases and our status offense cases. The focus of the program at the outset was on diversion, trying to keep people out of the system. 55% of the people who come into our courts would not come back into court without any intervention. A great number of cases can be systemically diverted if we really have the political will to do so. We're hoping to expand, and we are expanding restorative justice into schools. Because restorative justice really has its most authentic power in the community when people really own it. Schools can address issues without unnecessary court referral. Of the material that I circulated, I also circulated a piece that I wrote that was published in Commonwealth Magazine last year. All Kids Deserve a Second Chance. I think that's the title. I forget exactly what it is. But it's directly related to this expungement piece. It's directly related to what Brian Stevenson talks so eloquently about. None of us should be defined by our worst action, especially when we're kids. I could share with you instances of my own growing up where I avoided criminal justice involvement only because I had the support that a lot of our kids don't. And I will share a little story. This will be the last thing I say. I got the 2-minute warning, and I think it sort of is very evocative. I had a few mishaps in my adolescence. I was what might be characterized as a mischievous youth. But one of them involved going into a candy store. We called them in New York City, a candy store. And I was getting my dad's Sunday Times. I took a magazine of my own choosing. I will not tell you what the magazine was. Suffice it to say that as I was leaving the candy store, the owner of the store, it was called Michael's Luncheonette. He said, "Not so fast, Jay. Where do you think you're going?" My response was sort of humma, 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 humma. He says to me, "I can call the cops or I can call your old man." What do you think I said? Well, call the cops, because I knew what was about to ensue. You know, and that's exactly what came to pass. You know, my walking home that day, I still remember it. It was my version of Dead Man Walking. But I didn't realize at the age of 13 how extraordinarily lucky I was to have avoided the criminal justice system. I had one or two other incidents of a somewhat similar nature, but here I am all these many years later, and I could say what a long, strange trip it has been. But I would not be here had I not had a support system that a lot of our young people do not have. So working with organizations such as this, working with people such as Susan Maze-Rothstein's Legal Skills in Social Context program, which made me a client to help create a restorative justice program, I would not be privileged to be part of what I think is a really, really exciting initiative, RJ. And while I'm focusing now on diversion because of the expungement piece at the front end and school-to-prison pipeline, there's no reason we can't use restorative justice at every step of the criminal process. Thank you.
I have been asked to speak a little bit about restorative justice itself, so and how that is functioning. Jay, Judge Blitzman, I call him Jay because
Simply Jay, please.
Okay, Jay.
I'll be judge later. I prefer to be Jay.
Jay has laid a very nice foundation about what I would call the systemic issues. The systemic issues are vast, and they are endemic. And so I want to talk a little bit about restorative justice itself, and then in the schools, the courts, and in our communities. Can I just quickly get a show of hands? How many of you feel that you have a working knowledge of what restorative justice is? That's great. So I will tailor my comments accordingly. I always do that in a class because then you know like where to start, right? As you probably know, restorative justice is a time-honored, that is, it's a gift to us in this modern society from indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples who are able to manage their communities and their societies for eons. We are like a flash in the pan here in the United States with our couple hundred years under our belt, as compared to many, many indigenous peoples who used restorative justice practices. And they weren't called that at that time. They were called many other things nationally, internationally, and throughout the world. Restorative justice is a post-1980s kind of term for this set of indigenous practices, but we have been gifted really by Native peoples. Here in the United States, First Nation peoples, the Navajo people, with the understandings of restorative justice practices. Now, what makes that such an important point? Jay was just talking about our Western system of justice, or what we call justice, which is sadly a conflation of ideas of justice with ideas of punishment. Right? And putting the power of all of that in the hands of the state. So the state is the inflictor of punishment. That paradigm, and then we call that justice when it's in a criminal justice form. All of that, unfortunately, does not amount to justice, and most people, or many, many people, who experience it on the victim side, what we call victims, or those who have been harmed, they experience it as not justice because it doesn't make things right. It doesn't make things better. Somebody is punished, somebody is pulled out of their community, somebody is pulled away from their family, but it doesn't bring back what was the harm. It doesn't make the harm right. We have, in recent years, increased our attention to victims, and so we have, in many, many court fora, victim statements that are often done at the end of a proceeding, and those victim statements are often set into the wind. There's no requirement that anyone respond to them. They don't necessarily amount to a sense of justice. I don't know how many of you in this room know Janet Connors, but Janet Connors came to restorative justice through the murder of her son. Several young men in her neighborhood, the week that he got his first apartment in his 20s, came and stabbed him in the heart. She went through the criminal justice system, and 2 of the young men were found guilty. The young man who actually did the stabbing made a plea and fought and got off eventually. She felt as though she had been put through the ringer. She felt that there had been no justice. And so she spent the next 10 years of her life learning about restorative justice until she had the courage to meet with the young men who were incarcerated. And she did restorative justice work together with them. She realized that these young men were going to actually be released back to the community. And so what she wanted to repair the harm as best as it could be repaired, because there's never a return of a dead child, was she wanted these young men to come out and become pillars of their community, because they were from the very same community that her son was raised in. So 2 of them did exactly that. They came out, they became fathers, they became employed members of the community, and to this day are helping to spread the word about what it means to change one's life by doing an act like that. So what we have as an opportunity in restorative justice is a shift of paradigm away from the crime and punishment model, the conflated crime and punishment, where due process matters a lot because you have the massive resources of the state versus the minute resources of the individual, and you have to protect the individual from the massive resources of the state by due process, which usually means that the person who is the accused never takes full responsibility for what they may have done, because you have to protect them from the resources of the state. And as a matter of your soul, it is not a good thing to not be able to take responsibility for your actions. This is something that restorative justice knows deeply and implicitly, that we must be accountable to one another for our actions, and we must take responsibility, and then we must work together as a community to make things as fair as possible. So because we don't do this with our standard justice system, we create lots and lots of imbalance. We take people out of their communities. We take people away from their families. And it so happens, not surprisingly, based on our history of slavery, that we take more black and brown people in these situations. So to me, the work of restorative justice is extraordinarily urgent and important for our society because we are not well. The Navajo saying to greet one another in ancient times and to this day was not hello, hey, how you doing? It was, and so how are the children? And so how are the children? Because if your society's children are not well, your society will never be well. So our restorative justice has done work in the school systems. We've also done work in the court systems. I want to say a couple of words. I saw the 2-minute warning. A couple of words about restorative justice in relation to the court systems, because as Judge Blitzman has said, restorative justice should be used at every stage along the school to prison pipeline, and I agree entirely with that. However, the devil's in the details. So, for example, in juvenile process, there is a 6-month window for the time that a diversion is allowed to the time that it has to be back in front of the judge for a determination of whether a juvenile delinquency case goes forward. 6 months, my friends, is not a good length of time to do deep restorative justice practices about harm. What is the harm? How did it happen? What can we do to repair it together as a community and to get that work done and underway? So that's one example of the challenges of working within the existing system. The challenge is, how do we give the system enough pushback so that the system moves over some, so that the system itself becomes accountable in some ways? We should not be thinking of restorative justice practices as a way to correct bad kids, for example. We should be looking at restorative justice practices as a way to recalibrate our societal understanding of justice and to re-empower our communities in their decision-making using restorative justice practices and in their requirements of the existing system. I'm going to wrap up there, but I want to say I will be back a little later to talk with you about restorative justice legislation that is now pending before the state legislature and ways that you can be involved. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. It's a great honor. We've been supported by the Lenny Zakim Fund for 3 years, and it has helped us as an organization to grow and to help our board and our staff to learn. A lot of the subjects that you've heard about today, the topics, I'm very familiar with. I started out as a student in the Boston University College Behind Bars prison program. I never thought that I'd be here today, 30 years later, as a director of a program helping others that have been in my place in the past. I want to speak about what happens to people that are not afforded access to the resources that we've been speaking about here today. Our program, Partakers, we match incarcerated students with mentors from around the greater Boston area. We have 30 different organizations that we collaborate with that supply us with those mentors. Recently, Tufts University, Boston University, Emerson have all come forward to fulfill the need of educating incarcerated students. The school to prison pipeline is very important in the work that we do because we get the end results of the failure of the system to help people. We are the last line in turning people around. What we do at Partakers is we educate students that are incarcerated, give them an opportunity to have a dialogue with their mentors and to get a sense of accountability, and some through the restorative justice programs, and to be able to return to society as contributing members. One of the important things is, to me, most important is how does that incarcerated person come back to society? We have women and men in our program. Often the face of an incarcerated person is a male. But I just want you to know that in our program, we have plenty of women that we are reaching out to every day and trying to help. Without access to resources, there's a subclass of citizenship that is created that feeds the cycle of recidivism. It's very important to use all of the entities that are available in the community to help keep people from going back to prison. We've recently partnered with the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizen. As of a week ago, we became a community partner with Kevin Sibley in the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizen. And what that means to us, just so that you know, what's important is because somebody gets out of prison and they have a college degree from BU, Tufts, or Emerson, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to get a job. That just means that they have an education. Working with the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizens, that allows us to have access to their pipeline of jobs and resources that will give the people in our program an opportunity to reach their full potential. What is the problem? We face the problem and we address the problem of recidivism. There have been so many people that get out of prison and they go back because, number one, they don't have a job. Number two, they don't have a stable home plan. There's a lot of stigmatization that's attached to them. They're often referred to as ex-convicts, ex-felons. No matter what it is that they do, there is not a language of humanity that's attached to them. They could have committed the offense 30 years ago. They're still referred to as an ex-convict or ex-felon. All of this is very, very damning in helping them to proceed in life post-incarceration. I want to say that our success rate is phenomenal. In 20 years, we have a 2% recidivism rate. Now, if anybody doesn't know what that means, across the nation it's 68. Boston, the DOC in Boston will tell you theirs is 37 or 40, depending on who's regurgitating the statistics and for what purpose. But 2%, in 20 years, I've only seen 3 people go back to prison through this program. They come out, they have an attachment to their mentors, they have jobs, and they have potential. Like I said, our biggest challenge is jobs, finding a way to attach people to employment that is progressive. I don't mean just working at a Dunkin' Donuts or something like that, but a job that allows them to go on further in life. Our conversations with people from around the city and the state, they grow because of our connections with the Lenny Zakim Fund. We're able to network with plenty of people that we've never even had the opportunity to become involved with before. I want to call your attention to women. Women are the fastest growing population in prison, okay? We try our hardest to focus in on that, and Andrea James she'll tell you, it's a lot of work, and it's something that needs a lot of attention. So we try to very sincerely to focus on that. And the reason that I'm mentioning that to you is because, as Jay said, as Judge Jay, I'm sorry. Nobody wants to be defined by the worst moment in their life. I go to the graduations in the prisons, and we see the impact of our work. We see the impact of the donors and the gifts that you give us that allow us to recruit mentoring teams, recruit churches, and recruit organizations to help us do this work. One particular lady in prison, her name is Jessica, she always wrote to us saying that she didn't feel there was anything else that she could do once she got out of prison because she didn't have a home plan, she didn't have support. So we enrolled her in the College Behind Bars program, and we assigned her a mentoring team to her. And she graduated from Boston University while incarcerated last year. It was like almost, when you go to these graduations, their families are there. They fly in from around the country, from out of state and everything, and even from overseas. So you're there watching this woman graduate, and it's just a very relaxed and profound moment. But it's also very tearful in a way. Jessica's mentor, his name is Robbie, a team of 6. Robbie wrote me a letter and said that he had to move to Washington, D.C., and he could no longer be Jessica's mentor. But he wanted to be involved in her life and write when he was in D.C. and also visit when he was in Massachusetts. And I said, okay, fine, that's great. So he was still a mentor. Robbie did not tell me he worked at the White House. What he did was he told President Obama about our program and about Jessica, and when she graduated, the impact that it had on her life. And he wrote her a letter, which I'd like to read to you. It's a very short letter. Dear Jessica, well, first of all, the White House, let me do that. Washington, D.C., May 25th. It's on this. Dear Jessica, Michelle and I are delighted to send our heartfelt congratulations on your graduation. In your achievement, I see not only the culmination of years of hard work, but also a unique piece of the mosaic you form with students from the class of 2016 across our nation. Together, you embody an America that finds unity in its diversity, draws strength from a spirit of common purpose, and aspires to reach the breakthroughs of tomorrow. Unencumbered by what has been and unafraid of new frontiers, you remind us that what has kept our country moving forward through everything we have experienced, what defines us above all, has always been our unwavering belief in the possibilities of the future. Congratulations again on this accomplishment as you reflect on the efforts that brought you to this moment and look forward toward all that lies ahead. Know that your president is proud of you and inspired by your generation. Sincerely, Barack Obama. That is our work. This is what we do, and this is why I get up and come to work every day. That lady's life has been changed forever. Her mentoring teams has her. We have her. We will support her as she comes home, and we will also make sure that she's connected to the resources of the mayor's office so that she can reach her fullest potential. The rate for going back to prison, the timeline when you get out is 36 months. That's the danger zone. If you do not plug into everything that can help you, usually within 36 months, people recidivate. Because of mentors like Robbie, because of programs like ours and restorative justice programs, we all work together hand in hand to make sure that the recidivism rate becomes lower, and also that the people that are in our program reach their best potential. Thank you.
Every time I hear Arthur, he just moves me and inspires me to get up and go do something else. And I had the privilege of joining them at their last graduation ceremony at Partakers, and it's an incredible experience, but most profound because the people that are the stars are missing because they're incarcerated. And I remember leaving there and just thinking on the drive home that if you go through Arthur's program and you graduate and you're incarcerated, you need to come home. That needs to be like the benchmark for early release. If you've accomplished all that happens through the Partakers program, it's really just an incredible work that you do, Arthur, and thank you very much. I am just completely honored to be here with my mentor, Judge Blitzman. We go way back, of course, and long before I even became a lawyer, I worked with Jay at the Youth Advocacy Project. It was an incredible experience back in the early 90s. And Jay really was the first time that I had really seen, other than my father, somebody who just was unapologetic in their fierceness in defending the children in our community. And I learned that from Jay and from my dad, but it was refreshing again as an adult coming into this work to get it again from Jay. And he supported me unconditionally through my incarceration. And it's always a pleasure to be here. And Professor, I'm an alum. I graduated from Northeastern, and I was very lucky to be there when Dean Hall, David Hall was our dean, who was just, that alone, if you were an African-American student at Northeastern Law School at the time that David Hall was there, and he and his son Rasan and I were classmates, it's an experience that you just would never forget. And I was very privileged to have that. So. It's great to be here. Jude, you guys know Zakim, we're here because of Zakim. I mean, there's nothing really else to say about that. Our organization is Families for Justice as Healing. We're an organization of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls. And we started to do our work. I was a trial lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer here in Massachusetts, primarily practicing in Boston. I also, later in my practice, became a real estate conveyance lawyer, and as a result of that, I ended up serving a 2-year federal prison sentence for wire fraud. It's a whole nother story. You can read it in my book, Upper Bunkies Unite. But that was a completely traumatic experience in my life. I was sentenced to serve a 2-year prison sentence in another state. There are no women's federal prisons in Massachusetts. So I packed up, and a caravan of my family drove me to the federal prison for women in Bembury, Connecticut, and I lived in that prison for 2 years. I had been a criminal defense lawyer. I had learned from the greats such as Jay Blitzman and Leslie Harris and just a host of other people that wrapped their arms, Yolanda Acevedo, all of these great public defenders who poured into me the importance of the work that we do as public defenders. And so I didn't think there was anything more that anybody could tell me about how broken our criminal legal system is until I grew up in Roxbury. My kids are the 4th generation to grow up in our home. I know firsthand. I had the privilege of attending Milton Academy. I saw up close and personal the difference between how children at Milton Academy were treated, the unconditional support. Whatever it was, we worked it out. They were, patted on the back and lifted back up and went on to Yale and Harvard and all the incredible, and Northeastern, all the incredible places that privileged children get to go, never skipped a beat. And I also saw the children in my community who began to enter the juvenile system and then led up to the adult system. It was very, very clear to me at a very early age that this was happening. And I unfortunately became one of those statistics because we have a system in this country that believes that there is no other way to address a problem or a situation than to start first with a period of incarceration. And that is so incredibly destructive. But while I was in that prison in Danbury, Connecticut, when I walked in that door, I thought I knew it all. It's not true. When I became an incarcerated woman is when I actually became an expert as a criminal justice reform person and a prison abolitionist. I was in prison with 2,000 other women who were from all across the country, who were poor, predominantly African American and Latina, and they had not seen their children, literally, for at least 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 years. Some of them had lost completely contact with their children. Some of them had actually been forced into adoption of their children because we have laws in this country that allow for that if a woman is absent from a child's life for more than a couple of years. So it got me off my prison bunk. I knew what it was like to be a mother. My youngest daughter at the time, was 12 years old. And my baby boy, my last child, was 5 months old. I was still breastfeeding him when I left him in the parking lot of the prison to walk in there. He refused to take a bottle, and that was something that was completely devastating and traumatic for all of us. And so I was lucky. My husband and my parents drove my children to see me every single weekend. Snowstorm, rain, sleet, didn't matter. I used to pray sometimes that they wouldn't come because the weather was just so bad, but they did. I never missed a visit. There were times when we were the only people sitting in the visiting room because the women that we have crammed into prisons are poor women. They are women who have suffered injustices themselves from the time that they were children. 95% of currently incarcerated women are victims of sexual violence from the time that they are children. It is a common theme that runs through the lives of incarcerated women. I was in prison in 2010 and 2011, and at that time there was a NPR. We used to, if you had the money in your commissary account, you could purchase a clear transistor radio with these little earbuds. I listened to that thing constantly. I kept it in my ears. It kind of took me to another world outside of the prison, and a 5-mile walk to keep my sanity, because either you go and walk or you get in the pill line. 65% of the women who are incarcerated are on psychotropic drugs just to handle the experience of being separated from their children and locked up in a prison. And so my choice was to go and walk that track. It turned into a 5-mile-a-day jog, and I listened to NPR because it reminded me of my dad. Every day. If you go to my dad's house right now, my parents have NPR blasted in every single room in the house. And I heard Alec Exposed. It was an NPR series about the American Legislative Exchange Council and all of the work over decades that they did to pour money with the NRA and private billionaires into creating hard-on crime legislation and policy that governs this country to this day and brought us to this place of mass incarceration. And I said, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. There was also on the other side an uptick in conversation around ending mass incarceration, but I was crammed in a prison with 2,000 other women that had all sorts of gender-specific issues I didn't hear anybody talking about. Nobody was talking about the lives of these women, how they landed on a prison bunk, and the devastating effect that their incarceration was having on their children and on our communities as a result of that. And so we said in that prison, we're going to do that. I had the privilege of teaching while I was there. I taught GED classes, English, science, and English as a second language. And one of the Native sisters gifted me with a book when she graduated, when she got her GED, and she was about to leave, and she gave me a book that was under her bed, under her bunk. It was all dusty, and it was called Justice as Healing. And it was a book that was written by a Canadian prosecutor about everything that restorative justice is built upon, that the professor spoke about around restorative justice and the importance of a circle and of the community coming in to say, first, we love you, you matter, you have value. This is not anything about whatever this offense is that you've been charged with, but let's first start with talking about how important you are to this community, who you belong to, and how much we love you. I was just floored. I read the book literally overnight on my bunk, and we got up the next morning and we started our organization and started organizing within the prison, and we called ourselves, and still to this day, are known as Families for Justice as Healing. And so we use our voices as the directly affected women to say, one, we cannot have meaningful criminal justice reform without the voices of the people most directly affected. And that cannot only be men. There are a lot of issues that are gender specific that need to be made aware, people need to be made aware of, and that we need to address the harm that is caused, the further harm that is caused when you separate mothers from their children and take women, whether they're mothers or not, out of our communities is always mostly more harmful than whatever she did to land on that prison bunk. And if you know the more accurate portrait of women on a prison bunk, then you will know that a prison environment, prison as we know it today, will never, ever, ever be the place to help a woman heal and advance her life. And it's why our huge goal is ending incarceration of women and girls. We mean it. It's not just a slogan for us. We actually mean it. We know that it's daunting, but we intend to make it the inevitable. And so with the help of Lenny Zakim, Jude has been walking with us from day one. And we're here, and Jeanette, and we get training and technical support that we could never afford. And more importantly, we build leadership in women. And we actually have now a national council of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women as a result of the work that we've been able to do at Families for Justice is Healing. So women who are formerly incarcerated now are connected and using their voices in their local organizations, but in a connected way, so that we can get us and move the needle further towards ending incarceration of women and girls. So I'm profoundly grateful for the support that we continue to receive, Jude, and thank you very much for believing in us.
Okay, final lesson for today. The last thing that I've been asked to speak with you about is a little bit about, so what can you do to get involved right now if you are not yet involved? The powerful story that Andrea just told and the work of Partakers is amazing, amazing work. It is vital work, but the truth of the matter is the vast majority of our most intelligent African American men have been incarcerated. I work in higher education. Black men from the United States of America are almost like an endangered species. There are so few of them applying to graduate programs. So we have a massive system that creates control of poor people, particularly poor Black and brown people. And we control them by taking them out of the workforce, out of the running, out of everything that is available to others. It is in itself a almost criminal approach to organizing a society. So the legislature right now here in Massachusetts is working on what we call an omnibus crime bill. You've heard a lot about it. It has been a point of focus. In that crime bill are many, many bills that have been working for many, many years and have been collected together so that we now have a 200 or 300 page bill on reforming crime. Among those items that are addressed in that bill are a number of items that affect juveniles in particular. As Judge Blitzman mentioned, there is this notion of addressing the expungement issue in our legislation. That most states expunge juvenile records. Young people make mistakes. for there to be a lifelong record that affects your ability to be educated further, to obtain employment because you did something as a child, is really violence within the life of a human being. So I have put out on the middle table a list of the juvenile justice reform items that are there for you to be able to support in the omnibus crime bill. You can address your legislators. If you don't know who your legislators are, there's an easy way to find it on the website for the State House. But there are very specific things going on the juvenile reform side of this bill. We are now at the conference committee level. So just very quickly, the conference committee level is after the House has done their work and the Senate has done their work. There are now two bills, two omnibus crime bills. They go to a conference committee to reconcile the two bills, and then language from each of those bills is generally elected, and from that comes a single bill which is sent out to the floor for an up and down vote. This conference committee, which will begin in January, the members of the conference committee have been identified. There are about half a dozen of them in total, House and Senate. And these are the folks that you want to reach out to if there is something that you would like to support or you would like to have changed. Generally, they will choose between the Senate side or the House side in terms of language. And on restorative justice itself, we have a House and a Senate version, both of which are okay-ish. So it's back to the devil being in the details. I have put a one-page document out on our position on the restorative justice issues. A central issue is confidentiality. So restorative justice functions from speaking truth from your heart. To speak truth from your heart, you cannot be worried about being prosecuted as you are trying to figure out what the harm is and how to repair the harm. Other harms may come to light as a result of your speaking truth. Truth-telling from the heart cannot be the subject of an investigatory tool. The district attorney's office would like it to be a confidentiality provision that extends only to the person who is accused and to the victim. Actually, everyone who participates in a restorative justice circle needs to be protected by confidentiality. Family members, community members, anybody who is relevant to that issue should be protected by confidentiality. Since the 80s, mediation has had a blanket confidentiality provision. Mediation is largely used in civil matters, but can also be used for victim offender mediation, which is criminal. And so we would like to have the same approach used in restorative justice. It is central to the development of restorative justice. We would also like stricken from both bills exclusions of serious harm. This restorative justice bill suggests that there are massive categories of serious harm that cannot be subject to restorative justice. My friends Rwanda used restorative justice after the genocide that was done in Rwanda. They called them the Gacaca courts in Rwanda. The restorative justice practices are appropriate for every single kind of human activity that human beings are capable of. And so to eliminate whole categories of offenses from restorative justice eligibility is actually going to harm the growth and development of restorative justice in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I would encourage you, if you'd be so kind, to attend to your own legislators and write to them, call them, take the little items that are on the table there and please make a statement about how you would like to see restorative justice grow in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay and Susan and Arthur and Andrea, for what you've shared with everybody today. And most importantly, I want to thank you for everything you do every single day. And if I may be so bold, long into the night and on the weekends, to promote justice. We all really appreciate that. Before we get into Q&A, if I can find this mic, maybe Jeanette can help me. But I'd like it if each of you could, we've had a great overview of the issues from the perspective of each person speaking today. But if each of you could talk a little bit, 2 minutes, on the specific work that your agency is doing. And if there's anything else, you know, I always like to say, what else should we know? So about the specifics of how restorative justice works, what Partakers, Families for Justice is healing, what's happening in Chase Court. Yay, thank you. Then we can open it up to everyone here for comment and conversation. So thanks. Jay?
Hi, I'm back. I just want to say really, really quickly, having been the beneficiary of listening to the amazing presentations of the people that followed me, I felt a little guilty sitting here. I use this expression in characterizing my adolescence. I said that I was mischievous. And I was just sitting here thinking, if I were not a white person of privilege, I would not have been perceived as mischievous. I probably would have been expelled from school. People of color are 3 to 5 times more likely to be expelled than white students, in part because of implicit bias. So I just wanted to share that, so much for mischievousness. So in terms of addressing Jude's inquiry, we're doing now with our RJ. By the way, RJ was created as a result of about 5 to 6 years of systemic conversations regarding how to do business differently. So we were bringing people together in Lowell, where I sit, from schools, from the court, from the prosecutor's office, public defender, court clinic, to explore alternatives. So that's important in understanding how our RJ was birthed as a diversionary process. We take court referrals now from the Middlesex District Attorney's Office. We're one of the diversionary tools in their kit. Case can be referred for restorative justice. In order to not be reliant on prosecutorial referrals, as reflected in the material that's on your tables, we've expanded to include status offense cases. For those of you who are not familiar with the court process, status offense cases are non-criminal or non-delinquency matters. They involve youth who run away, youth who are habitually stubborn, youth who go to school but don't behave, and youth who don't go to school. So those are not criminal cases. So we found that that's a good source of referral, because we could also have more readily have more conversations without worrying about the court piece. In those kinds of cases, what I've been doing historically for years has been getting off the bench and sitting at a table, having my own circle. So I realized that I was sort of doing something that was restorative, and I think that's why I initially was invited to Northeastern Law School for a restorative justice conference. And I just want to share this quickly because I thought this was really funny. A number of years ago, I was invited to participate in a restorative justice conference at Northeastern. The plenary speaker was Sujatha Baliga. Those of you who know about restorative justice may have heard of her. She's an iconic figure in the restorative justice world, and she was there as a fellow talking about restorative justice. And one of the other persons sitting at the table next to me is Carolyn Boyce Watson, who runs the Restorative Justice Center in Suffolk, another iconic figure in restorative justice. And she turns to me and she says, "Jay, what are you doing here? You came to my class 10 years ago to tell me because of your due process concerns that you don't believe in restorative justice." So I just sort of smiled sheepishly, and I said, well, I guess that was then. At that point, I was putting my toe in the restorative justice water. So, and and now our RJ is working collaboratively with Carolyn Boyce Watson. So, just goes to show you that I wasn't too old to change. And I think that's a lesson in this, because I think a lot of us get locked into our own sense of orthodoxy. We know what we know. We don't want to look at data. We don't want to look at evidence-based practice. And we continue to do the same foolish things that have not really been working. The other area that RJ is involved in now, which I'm really excited about, is one involving schools. So, for example, a specific example of how restorative justice has really had a palpable effect in schools involves a situation in Lowell High School. A student of African descent was elected president of the Lowell High School. His election was greeted negatively by a minority of white students. There was some very vicious, nasty racial epithets that were disseminated. By the way, social media, if you don't know it, that's the real weapon of mass destruction, especially for kids. The school superintendent, Salah Kofawi, whom I think is a wonderful man, brought us in to try to work with the student body. That's a very concrete, specific example. I said during my remarks that I think restorative justice has its greatest power when it's community-based. I'm hopeful about the legislation, but again, the problem with legislation is when you start to do something systemically, when you start getting involved in the political sausage, sometimes the real power of community-based RJ loses its vitality, its authenticity. So that's a caveat. That said, I'm really excited to be doing expansive RJ work in schools, because that's really how we can have more meaningful, strength-based conversations and really work on deconstructing the school-to-prison pipeline.
Thank you. And so I'll be brief because Jay and I are working together on our restorative justice. I want to pick up, though, on the school element. I have been a member of the Boston Public Schools Code of Conduct Advisory Council since 2010 and have worked to get restorative justice practices as one of the two alternatives to exclusion that has been recommended in the Boston Public Schools in their code of conduct. The issue now is to make that actually have life within the Boston Public Schools. And the way that we are working on that is in collaboration with Carolyn Boyce Watson and the Center for Restorative Justice. Our restorative justice is working with the National Institute of Justice and the American Institute of Research on a $2.7 million grant to do 30 Boston public schools with a whole school model and to track the research of the outcomes for a 3-year period to allow the restorative justice practices to be demonstrated to be an evidence-based approach. So that's very exciting work. Frankly, though, I would like to see the studies that have ever been done to show that mass incarceration is an evidence-based approach. Again, let's just every now and then mentally flip things back to the existing system when we're, requiring all these hoops be jumped through societally to demonstrate things. But the work of the Boston Public Schools is, I think, important because it is the largest public school system in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, with 130 schools. So if Boston is able to get this right, and those findings are written up, which they will be, then there's an opportunity for a greater outcome for all of the schools in the Commonwealth. We have the Education Law Task Force, of which I'm also a member, that has already offered to help advocate with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education the outcomes of the work in the Boston Public Schools through this study. So it's a very important piece. I think that we need need to interject restorative justice practices at every opportunity along the school to prison pipeline to deconstruct this pipeline that has taken generations to create, and communities have been damaged so deeply as a result. Thank you.
I think from my position, what's important is if you have something that works and is great, how do you recreate it? How do you help others? So at Partakers, as a young novice executive director, I'm trying to figure out what we did right for 20 years and how do we help others do the same thing. So my challenge and my vision is to be able to take what we have, what we've worked upon and what we've done, and to be able to spread it past Massachusetts and other areas. We started speaking with people in Providence, Rhode Island to duplicate this program. Number one, because they have a transit system that is easily accessible to the population there, and also because the prison population is all in one place. So this program of Partakers, College Behind Bars Mentoring Program, works well in that setting. So we've been speaking with people in different areas about how that would work, what would make it work, and how do we do it. We are speaking with different colleges that would be willing to come forward and help create an academic program and help fund it to duplicate what it is that we do. So for me, it works, and I know that what we do works, and I know why it works because of the help of so many people. There are a lot of different parts, moving parts that make our organization go. I would like to recreate that and extend the opportunities that we've been afforded to other people in other parts of the state. I don't think it's not a Massachusetts problem, as you can tell from the letter from President Obama. It's beyond that, okay? And I think that when we think about what it is that we have, there's a need far beyond just our present territory. I don't know how I'm gonna do that yet, but that's my goal.
Families for Justice as Healing, we're working on a lot of things, but the two primary projects that we are doing right now is the primary caretaker legislation. That's, again, Professor helped us to understand the process and where we are in the legislative process here in Massachusetts going into conference. Our bill, our little bill that could, called Primary Caretaker Bill, would provide alternatives to incarceration for people who are the primary caretakers of children. And we're talking women, because the majority of incarcerated women were the primary caretakers of their children prior to their incarceration. And we've partnered with the Brookview House right here in Massachusetts. I get to travel all over the country and a lot of times out of the country now. But we right here in Dorchester, Massachusetts have the flagship for what else is possible, other than letting the woman stay in her home. And so we've partnered with Brookview House on this, and we've actually made it to committee. Our language from our bill was written into the Senate side, and it wasn't written into the House side. But the co-chairs are in our corner 100%. Claire Cronin, Senator Brownsburg is the sponsor of our bill, and we've got a ton of support on both sides, the House and the Senate. So we're not giving up. We've made it this far, and so in the 11th hour, we're going to keep pushing. And so that's a very important thing in addition to restorative justice that we hope folks will really call their representatives, particularly the committee members, if you are represented by any of them, and let them know. So the last thing that I'll mention is the Women's Justice Circle, which is very, very important project. We've just launched it. It's starting with a women's listening tour of the communities that were profiled in Mass Inc. as the most targeted, where not one household in this corridor throughout Roxbury has not been affected by incarceration, talking to the women in those households, and then bringing it into the full circle of what we call the Women's Justice Circle, where we bail the woman, we do a participatory defense practice around her, which is in collaboration with Raj Jayadev, and the great participatory defense work they're doing in cities across the country now. We're the Boston partner with them now, and then we took the model from women's courts in India, where women had no rights to their children, no rights to their property, if their husbands decided to just move on or kick them out. And women literally sat in the community and created these women's circles where the women who had gone through that process come up with a recommendation and present it to the court. And so we decided that, learning from the women in India, that we're going to do the same thing. And so now, after we bail the woman, do a participatory defense around her, the Women's Justice Circle pieces, we take those of us who have been there, done that, we convene a circle around this woman of 5 to 7 women who have been exactly through the experience that this woman has gone through. If she's been struggling with the illness of addiction of heroin, we line those women up in a circle around her. And there's a lot of healing and process that goes into that sticks with the woman, but what comes out of that is a formal recommendation that we literally take into the court as a collective of women to say, we were her, she is I. 5 years ago, whatever the issue was, well, we were there 5 years ago, right? And here's where we are today, and here's what we know we need to help her and all the other women get to this same place. It's possible, and it gets us closer to ending incarceration of women and girls, and it gives the power, as you've heard the professor speak about, that is so important. It restores the power back to the women in our communities. So thank you.
Thank you, and I think you're right. I think there's a theme here about power with individuals, power with communities, and a different way of thinking about justice that is not only possible but growing. Questions? Oh, come on. Thanks, Barb.
What has been the response of people who felt victimized by the people you're talking about helping to restorative justice?
You know, when we go to prison, there's no accountability other than the fact that we're forced to go into prison. I mean, we don't have an opportunity, even if we want to speak to victims. But part of that circle is the opportunity for people, if they choose to, who have been victimized by a person, to come and be a part of that circle. And so,
do you get takers?
Well, one thing that's important about restorative justice is, this is important. The notion of restorative justice, it's not supposed to be imposed on a community. So part of repairing harm means the community, that is the harmed community, whether it's an individual or a community, participates. They have to agree. It's not mandated. That's really that's the model. Now, restorative justice in prisons is different because the victim is not going into the prison. So that's a very different kind of concept.
And can I just add something just to finish that out? As women who are justice-involved women, they're victims. They themselves are victims. We're trying to expand. We're trying to bring dignity back to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated and justice-involved women. And that does include other victims. But our focus with the Women's Justice Circle is putting a focus to create the support around this woman so that there is no further harm that is caused as we go forward. So our focus really, and understandably, yes, we do care about victims because we were all victims at one time. But our focus with this particular project, and I'm not speaking for restorative justice, I'm just speaking about what we are calling the Women's Justice Circle, is to give support and dignity to this woman who is going through this process.
I would like to just add to that as well that together with the volition piece, volition is central to restorative justice practices. In our restorative justice work, we always approach what we call the harm party and the responsible party. We don't call them the offender and the victim. The victim, after all, is such a victimizing, it puts people in a place of harm that it's hard to get out of, for the love of God. What Andrea is addressing is that when there's harm, it is often very hard to identify exactly who is the harm and who is the harmed. Who is the harmer and who is the harmed. Then there are times when it is very clear. But if you start to dig into harm, you start to see that harm comes from a lot of different sources and that culminates in an event. So, looking at this as a separation, a firewall between victim and offender, is a polarization that actually just keeps us from each other and figuring out ways of repairing harm.
I just quickly want to make a pragmatic observation, because I hopefully you heard in my introductory remarks that a lot of what we're talking about from various perspectives not only is good for the people involved systemically, but it's going to better protect public safety and in a much more affordable way. So the restorative justice process, for example, resolves cases much more quickly than the criminal paradigm and at infinitely less cost. So that's something to keep in mind. The fact when Arthur talks about reentry, that's what you're in part talking about. That's hugely important for public safety. So as you hear about these strength-based models, they really make a lot of sense, both from the perspective, again, of individuals and also from a public safety and systemic perspective.
Yeah, bringing up public safety again, I have a question. In my work, I do restorative justice in the context of reentry, and like the language of public safety, I have had a really difficult time with over the last couple of years, and just how that language can assume vilification, and the term that we've started using at Thrive Communities is wholeness in community. And I just wondered if there's any reflections that this group might have around that language shift that we've taken on as an organization, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
And thanks. Before you hand the mic back,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you and each person who asks a question to identify yourself and your organization.
Yes, so my name is Kim Yassir. I'm with Thrive Communities of Massachusetts. We do restorative reentry.
Thanks, Kim. We have an eager panel.
Yeah, so I think each one of us wants to get a piece of this one. I do a lot of work with UTEC, United Teen Equality Center in Lowell. Their focus now, focus is on reentry for the very reasons you're talking about. So their street workers are going into jails, houses of correction, state prisons, DYS. So, Arthur, you talked about 36 months. It's really like 72 hours, right? Finding a person a job, giving them respect, dignity, treating them as a valued individual, to make that community connection so they're healthily reintegrated into the community and not further stigmatized because they paid their proverbial debt. Now let's progress and treat everybody with the same dignity we accord each other and get away from demonizing each other as the other.
The population that I deal with, that we work with, that you support, we are very certain about one thing, and that's changing the language of how we refer to them. We do not use language that stigmatizes. We refer to them as people. So if you ever want to know what is the right language to use, formerly incarcerated person, the families of formerly incarcerated persons, we refer to them as people, and we call that language humanistic. That's the language that we attach to the work that we do, and it's very important because, let's say, for an example, you stole a candy bar, Judge Jay, when you were 9 years or 19 or whatever, and you're still being introduced as a former thief, former felon. So the use of that language is very important. It's hard to get out of our culture because it's ingrained. All documents, even through our documents, when I look back for 20 years ago, I still see words like inmate, ex-felon, or prisoner, they're being released. All of those terms are absent of dignity.
Yeah, and I would like to also indicate that we need to think hard about, even at the grantor level, what we expect in terms of language from our grantees. So there are many grantors who seek language for high-risk youth. Well, the youth are not high risk, I mean, they're children. Why should we be categorizing in a stigmatizing way the expectations for even seeking funding? The need for us to work on language and how we refer and the mental pictures that are created for us as we speak about one another. What we're talking about is trying to regain our footing and balance in community with each other. The centerpiece of restorative justice practices is that we are all unbelievably and quite intimately interconnected. And when we keep creating divisions between ourselves, we create more and more trouble for ourselves.
Can I just say one last thing with that? There's a great article about this. The formerly incarcerated community across the country has come together and is asking people to cease using the word inmate, convict, ex-convict, whatever. And there's an article about that, the Marshall Project, and if you don't know about them, you should read a lot of their stuff that they're putting out now. But if you Google Marshall Project and use of the term inmate, there is a fantastic article where many of us are interviewed about why, as a collective community of formerly incarcerated people, we are asking for that to stop. That includes being written into legislation, that includes being written into policy, that when we talk to, whether it's wardens of jails or prisons or COs who insist on calling people inmates, that we just stay true to the language that we want people to use and be the example that we want to see. So such as, and even we've pushed it even further, not just formerly incarcerated women and girls, but we actually just say women and girls who had the experience of incarceration. We cannot begin to shift this unless we put the humanization back into who people are and the dignity back into their lives. Because otherwise, you'll continue to wanna, not care about an inmate or an ex-inmate, but you will stop and pause if you're talking about a woman or a girl. So I thank you. That's a really, really important question that you're asking. There's an entire movement in the country now to really push that and to raise awareness around how people are asking to be referred to.
How do I get the mic to you?
That's Jude's job.
It's I have to have a job. Timothy, Marshall. Ann, thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Marshall Ray. Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought her voice was kind of deep.
I think I'm the
We'll go
oldest
the other
person
way.
in the room. Come on.
No, I'm older
Oh.
than you are.
Marshall Rayner, Hawthorne Youth and Community Center, but my question is very basic. How do we take the concepts you've talked about, the sense of community, and bring it to those new parenting people? Is there a place for prenatal instruction here, doula instruction? I mean, we've got to start again, obviously, because we have not done a good job. But where do we start? Where can these principles be reintroduced?
Thank you.
So there's a need for training and to get started with restorative justice practices. So the Center for Restorative Justice, which Jay mentioned, Carolyn Boyce Watson, has been doing training in restorative justice for 20 years. There's been a lot of work with the children's defense pieces, as well as Home for Little Wanderers. There has been with DSS and DYS. So it really, unfortunately, a lot of that work is contract work. And so then contract work, you have to wait for people to want something to happen, right? They have to approach in order to. So if you can get dialogues going within the areas that you're working, perhaps you can spur an interest so that there can be a request, but then you have to create resources flowing in that direction. So you know, it's always about, there's an almighty dollar at the bottom of all of this. And that's why I personally believe in justice reinvestment, which is something that the Department of Justice worked on for the last 10, 20 years. There are 17 states that are engaging in justice reinvestment, which is when you reform your criminal justice system, the savings from that reform, and it can be as simple as changing sentencing guidelines, etc., the amount of money just shoots into the millions quickly. That money should be reinvested in the communities that have been damaged for work like this, so that we can start to build the community at the community level.
Thank you. Thanks. Timothy.
Thank you. My name is Tim James, work at State Street Bank around the corner. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's my first introduction to the concept, so I want to thank the panel. Very informative and also moving for me, hearing from all of you. So I want to the question I have is something related to something that Arthur said, which was that the greatest challenge is around the jobs and also dealing with the stigma. I just want to know what kind of things can be further done as well to help people in dealing with that, specifically the stigma piece, because it seems like such a complex issue, and one that I'm glad that there's organizations like yours that are addressing. I'd just be interested to hear further thoughts from you on how that can be addressed as well.
I just got to.
Yeah.
So, it's a great question. I want to bring it back to expungement. And you know, when Michelle Alexander talked about the stigmatization, you know, the box, what follows with you, you know, she was writing about adults, but it's actually true or truer of kids. Is you think about the collateral consequences that attach to a delinquency adjudication. Could be school exclusion, family could lose their Section 8 housing, adverse immigration consequences. The consequences of adjudication are invariably more profound than the adjudication itself. So it does come back a lot to the second chances concept. Now that's manifested in different ways. I've been talking about diversion, but it certainly manifests itself as you go deeper into the system. You know, Brian Stevenson, you know, talks about this, about understanding our common humanity, forgiveness, moving forward. Susan talked about Janet Connors, whose son Joel was murdered. The first circle I went to, who was the one who was teaching me about circles, was Janet Connors. You know, so it's about understanding our common humanity, but also, you know, you're a banker. It's also helping society understand that this is also more affordable. Because if we deny these people from entering the workforce, we are going to cycle them endlessly into this system of mass incarceration. So it's a systemic conversation. And I also want to say, by the way, as regards to the systemic piece, let's not lose sight of the fact that when we talk about implicit bias, 2/3 of the kids that I see are going to schools that are still segregated. You know, so we're talking about not only implicit bias, we're talking about something that is profoundly structural. And we have to have a multifaceted conversation, because there's something wrong in the United States if 60 plus years after Brown versus Board of Education, our school systems are still more segregated than they were at the time of Brown. New York City is the most segregated school system in the United States. You talk about school-to-prison pipeline, we don't have that conversation, we're deluding ourselves.
Yes, Jay.
I think one of the things that an organization like a bank or any corporation can do to become, to have an impact on the issue is to work with the different organizations that are involved in our programming. For instance, it would be beneficial if you would become a community partner with the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizens. They're looking for organizations like you to partner with, like yours to partner with. They in turn contract with us for our students when they're released to see what type of opportunities are available to them. So I think that being involved in the arena, in the community that is focused on helping people post-incarceration is a natural thing for you to do. Also, it helps to what we call wraparound services. It puts a bow tie on that. It segues from incarceration, counseling services, organizations like Andrea's, and then ours, and then hopefully, you would become what we call a Corey-friendly employer. Somebody that looks at the applicant and takes everything into consideration as far as employment possibilities. And that's I think the best thing to do is to link up with organizations like the mayor's office.
Thank you, Arthur. Anne?
Well, I've shifted what I was going to say, actually. I'm Ann Bader-Martin. I'm actually a juvenile court attorney, sometimes administrative Judge Blitzman. I'm also founder of a nonprofit that the Zakim Fund is with, One Can Help. But I firstly want to just say this has been a phenomenal panel. I have found it fascinating. All the aspects come together under one roof because it's all about, there's a common thread of poverty for so many people. I don't know how many people understand that more than 80% of the children and families in the juvenile courts are in poverty. And then we take them to court with problems, and we don't recognize, as so many of you also said, that there's layers of problems. It's not, and where's the harm? And yes, there's the harm at the moment. You look at the kid, the person that may have done the harm, and you find out they were in foster care, you find out that they were abused, you find out that their parents were also. You can go generations back, and if you ask the right questions, you see the layers of the harm, you see the layers of the poverty, and then when they come to court, you want to think like doctors do. I always feel like that, the Hippocratic Oath. You want to feel like, at first do no harm, help them. Help them, either here for a problem, help them, how do we help them get better? And so I'm leading up to where I really want to go, and that is that the idea of we need to have resources to help them, and some people talked about lack of housing, and that housing is a huge one. I'd like to hear what other issues of resources make a difference to you. And then one comment, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, the person next to Judge Blitzman. Susan, thank you. Susan, you made one comment that made me almost jump out of my chair when you said about the impact studies, and I'm sure anybody here that's with a nonprofit had a moment where they went, about turn the impact studies on other people. When people ask, well, how do we know that providing resources to children and families in the juvenile courts will make a difference? What's the other side of that? Like you said, well, look how well things are going up till now. And yet we're being asked to prove that. And I wanted to talk about lack of resources, what resources you believe are missing would make a difference, and how you feel about impact studies and what we are able to provide.
Thanks, Anne.
So I'll go first, then I'll go to Susan.
Okay.
So, wow. So, when I spoke initially, I think this is before you came in.
What?
I did mention the Jill Lepore article. Those of you who want to learn a lot, that's all of us, right? I'd recommend this article written in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore, February 2016, called Baby Doe. She deconstructed the tragic story of the baby Bond case, the baby who was tragically found, I think, in Deer Island. She talks about the child carceral state. She cites some really interesting research. So, as regards the issue you're talking about, and 72% of the youth who were committed to our Department of Youth Services between 2010 and 2012 went through the Department of Children and Families. And the article is a really, really powerful deconstruction of a system which is focused on reactive back-end models, as opposed to a public health-oriented intervention model. And this issue of resources is implicated, because I think it's naive to say we're going to get more resources. I'm sorry. The question in part becomes, we have a pie which is limited. How is it going to be allocated so that we address these issues when we should address them in the beginning rather than pay more at the back end? So community-based restorative justice is just one example. It's an attitude. It's a methodology. We don't have a continuum of care. After deinstitutionalization, a lot of services were closed. The money never went into a robust continuum of care. But the back-end funding is infinitely more expensive, and it compromises public safety. That's what your question implicates, and that's why we are talking about a cradle-to-prison pipeline, because we're talking about the same children and families who are involved in juvenile justice, who are involved in child welfare, and there are increasingly poor families of color.
So we know this. The question is, why don't we have the political will to reverse this perverse allocation of limited resources?
At Jay's recommendation, I also read that article, the Baby Doe article, and I would strongly recommend it to everyone here because it is an extraordinary expose of the brokenness of the system with regard to how we allocate our resources, only enough to control the social control of the poor, to keep them out of our hair. It gets quite deep. We have a capitalist society. We have a tax bill right now which is about to create more disparities, greater disparities, at higher levels, with less in the middle and almost nothing for those at the very bottom. At the very bottom lives the various forms of control that the state exerts over poverty. And it's heartbreaking. The Lenny Zakim Fund is doing amazing work, but frankly, this is work that belongs to the society. And really, that's why I personally believe that over time, we need to press for justice reinvestment. If we get the omnibus crime bill through, if there is reform, if there is money saved, people should be looking to what money has been saved, and then there should be arguments that that money needs to be reallocated. Because right now, all of the small nonprofits, we are struggling to fight for crumbs in terms of resources. This is with all due respect to everybody who's involved in the nonprofit world. But at the end of the day, the resources are misallocated. It's not that we don't have enough resources, they're misallocated resources. We need to start to realize that, put pressure, identify it, and put pressure.
Can I just say something really quickly?
Yeah.
We're trying to figure this out. Housing is one of the drivers of recidivism for women, and lack of housing. A lack of appropriate housing, lack of clean, safe housing. And we've been meeting with a group of women who are hedge fund folks, believe it or not. They actually, let me redefine that. They manage money for wealthy women. And wealthy women, 51% are 51% of the wealth holders in this country now are women. And they are demanding now that not only people who manage their money manage it and continue to make them money, but they're also saying, we also want to do good. We also want to do good. And so we've been talking to this group of women through the RFK Human Rights. They do an annual conference with these people who manage other people's money, and talking about how do you begin to create some finance tools that, on a systemic change, address this issue of lack of housing for formerly incarcerated women and their children. And we're just talking about it. And I think that's one of the first things. We're thinking outside the box about who else is not being tapped into, that's looking for things to do with the goo-gobs of money that they have, and to bring formerly incarcerated women around the table with these women who run the Bloomberg Women's Fund. That's profound. There's a lot of tension still in there for a lot of reasons, but at the same time, we're trying to end incarceration of women and girls, and we know that housing is going to help us to get there, and there are people who are trying to figure out how to create that on a systemic level.
Thanks, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you all for making the time to be here today. Thank you, Andrea, Arthur, Susan, and Jay, for so generously and passionately sharing what you know and what your experiences are. I encourage everybody to learn more about these organizations, to read all the articles that have been suggested. I know I plan to. And thank you for your commitment to social justice.